Afternoon all. Hello. Let me know when you're good to go. This report from the Auditor-General, which is titled Implementing Machinery of Government Changes, is one of the most significant reports you will see in Queensland on the one-year anniversary from the handing down of a cold rake review. It shows that nothing has changed in the way that the state government views the public service, and it shows that nothing has changed when it comes to putting Queenslanders front and centre instead of the current approach of political survival. I want to read from you the Premier's comment at the time when she was asked by you about what the machinery of government changes meant. And machinery of government changes is code for the disruption that is experienced when different departments are merged and changed. The Premier said, and I quote, "The machinery of government changes are being undertaken with minimal cost and impact on departments." Well, this is what the Auditor-General said. They divert focus from leading service delivery. Departments will now shift their attention to change implementation, thus reducing their ability to focus on improving the efficiency and effectiveness of their service delivery. Machinery of government changes can take months or even years before new functions are fully integrated. I am concerned that government does not have a good enough understanding of the costs of the reorganisation, both initially and ongoing, as departments deliver new or altered services. And those costs run into the millions, despite what the Premier said. This report shreds the government's credibility on the so-called reshuffle. It was never about government services. It was never about Queenslanders. It was about political survival. And this report shows how disruptive it has been to the ability of the public service to deliver services for Queenslanders. And why does it matter? Queenslanders are paying more for inferior services. The only winner are the state government ministers who are being protected from being held accountable. And haven't we seen that on full display this week? The relationship breakdown between the Premier and the Health Minister is extraordinary, the likes of which we haven't seen for a long time. For the Premier to reveal that a resignation was given to her 24 hours before a minister stood up to defend that senior Mandarin shows you a government that is at war, a government that isn't talking to themselves. They aren't listening to Queenslanders, and they're not even listening to themselves anymore. This is a government at war with itself, and that is emanating in chaos and crisis in all they do. And unfortunately, it is the breakdown of services that Queenslanders rely on that matter the most. And those services are breaking down before their eyes every day. Over to you, Jarrod.
Well, thank you, David, and good afternoon. Jarrod, Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Well, as David described the changes that we saw in the Auditor-General report tabled yesterday, it is the disruption of government, and the people that suffer this constant disruption in the last 8 years under the Bleijie government is the people of Queensland, whether it's in the housing crisis, the youth justice crisis, or all the other chaos that we are seeing across the Bleijie government in their ministries and also their departments. So it is complete disruption which is costing Queenslanders money. You only have to look at the Youth Justice Department or Youth Justice generally to see this occurring. Now, when Anastasia Palaszczuk was elected in 2015, Yvette D'Arth was the Minister for Youth Justice under the Department of Youth Justice and Attorney General and Justice. Then, when Yvette D'Arth was failing in youth justice, they gave the department to Di Farmer. Then, when Di Farmer was failing in youth justice, they thought they'll set up a new department and called it Youth Justice because they thought that would fix the issues of youth justice. Then, when that failed, they abolished the Department of Youth Justice at hundreds of thousands of dollars, in the millions possibly, cost. Then, when Di Farmer failed in that regard in youth justice, they handed youth justice to Leanne Linnard under a new portfolio, and of course it changed again. Then, when Leanne Linnard failed in the youth justice space and tackling the youth justice crisis, they have now handed youth justice back to Di Farmer, who originally failed in this space, and the department has changed again. into small business department. So we can't understate the seriousness of the Auditor-General report in terms of these government changes and the disruption in the departments, not only when ministers change, but when they change all the portfolios, and you see the chaos and crisis that youth justice has been shipped around to all these departments with all failed ministers. It is the ministers responsible for these departments, and it is the ministers that must take responsibility for the youth justice crisis we see in Queensland. It's extraordinary that as we see the dysfunction and chaos unfold in this government, that the Health Minister and the Premier are not talking to each other. And as the Leader of the Opposition said, extraordinary circumstances where the Premier who leads the state, you've got the Health Minister responsible for the health crisis, is not even talking to the Premier about who is best placed to lead as Director-General the department. And I understand that was the case in the Justice Department. The Premier was not talking to Shannon Fentiman when she was the Justice Minister, and also changed the Director-General in the top. Today is another anniversary of this Palaszczuk government. Today is 6 months since Anastasia Palaszczuk announced the 10-point plan to tackle the issues of youth crime and the youth crime crisis in Queensland. You will recall this was the press release she issued just before she jumped on the jet and flew to Paris to have her holiday. So they announced that as a PR stunt to tackle the issues of the youth crime crisis. Well, I can tell you today, here's some statistics since these announcements were made in January, and this is Queensland Police statistics in the last 6 months. Stolen vehicles have gone up by 12% since January under the Palaszczuk government. Break-and enters up 10%, other thefts up 12%, and assaults up 4%. The facts are clear. Crime is getting worse under Labor. And when you have fewer police and weaker laws, you have a youth crime crisis. That's the story. That's it. Under the Palaszczuk government, we have fewer police on the beat and weaker laws, and we have a youth crime crisis. Since 2015, when Palaszczuk was elected Premier of the state, car thefts have gone up 110%. Car thefts, 110% increase since Anastasia Palaszczuk was elected in 2015, and break-and-enters have increased by 48% since 2015. No amount of PR, media spinners in the Premier's office, photo ops will fix the youth justice crisis. What will fix the youth crime crisis is laws. Laws that the opposition has put on the table that the government continually refuse to accept. We need consequences for actions. We need to unshackle the judiciary, get rid of detention as a last resort, and we need gold standard early intervention and prevention programs to make sure these young kids' lives are turned around. So if you look at whether it's housing, cost of living crisis, the youth crime crisis, we have chaos and crisis in this government. It reigns supreme. And I think it's disheartening this morning, and I've heard reports that the Premier described this chaos as a storm in a teacup. Well, only a Premier that has checked out in the middle of a health crisis would describe this as a storm in a teacup. Queenslanders know it far worse than that. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much. I just think it's a failure of leadership, and it's a sign that the government is so consumed with itself and in such a state of chaos and crisis that that would be assumed as business as usual in the eyes of the Premier. It is extraordinary. Can you imagine a situation where the most senior public servant in the middle of a health crime crisis would resign, and 24 hours later the Health Minister would step up and under her nose that change had been made and she wasn't aware, and the Premier didn't think it appropriate enough to pick up the phone and call? Has government in Queensland rotted to that stage that a minister and a Premier wouldn't speak about something that significant? And I wouldn't care if it didn't matter to Queenslanders. I wouldn't care if their petty little squabbles just saw them in that constant state of flux. But in the meantime, AMBOs aren't turning up. In the meantime, health workers are telling us about a war zone in emergency departments. In the meantime, Queenslanders pick up the phone and they don't get the help they need. And that's the problem. And this report shows it. This report says everything you need to know. It was never about a ministerial reshuffle or a reset. It was about trying to release a political pressure valve. It was never about Queenslanders. It was always about their political survival. And Queenslanders are living it every day. And if governments reach the point that a Premier and a Minister won't even talk to each other in the middle of a crisis, how on earth is it ever going to be fixed?
You guys called for especially a better to go, but now you're critical of how much it costs for that to happen.
No, that's a completely different thing. There's one thing about ministers changing. This report doesn't reflect on that. This report talks about the machinery of government changes. And the one that the Deputy Leader articulated highlights it better than any. Youth justice in and out and its own department and then merge with another and then throw it in with small business. That's what this report focuses on. And it's costing millions. And the Premier said it won't cost money and it won't cause interruptions. And this report shows that it's put a wrecking ball through the public service and their ability to deliver services for Queenslanders. That's our issue. Of course I want to see ministers held accountable, and you can bet your bottom dollar if government changes, they will be held accountable. That's vastly different to the structure and the makeup of the government. Ministers must be held accountable. Shuffling deck chairs and changing people's responsibility and moving those departments around, that doesn't create accountability. All it does is create disruption and confusion in the public service, and this report bells it so strongly.
Taking that point, David, should you become Premier next year, where do you think youth justice should sit alongside?
We're doing some work with that, Steph, and we're going to be serious about making sure that it has the ability to deliver what Queenslanders need. But I'll make this point. Wherever it sits and whoever is responsible, the victim will come first. And that is our rock solid guarantee. And we are going to rewrite the Youth Justice Act, and the underlying principle in all we do will be that the victim's rights must come before the offenders. We are absolutely going to unshackle the judiciary, and detention as a last resort is going to be removed. And I've reflected on a lot of the commentary I've heard from the Premier, trying to pass the buck to others. That will be the unshackling of the judiciary, and then Queenslanders will see. And we are going to get serious about gold standard early intervention. And I'm not going to give up on kids, and I'm not going to give up on turning people around. We're going to hold those ones accountable who for 8 years have been untouchable, have grown up through this system. They're going to be held accountable. But we are also going to turn the next generation around and deliver long-lasting reform and heal that youth crime crisis once and for all.
Mr Drummond's last day in the job was a couple of days before estimates. We asked the Premier whether or not the government had at least attempted to get him to stay to sit in estimates. She said no. Should they at least try?
Well, this is the Integrity Commissioner all over again, isn't it? When we desperately tried to ensure that the Integrity Commissioner could stay, and she even requested that she could, and the government just wanted to get her out the door, so she wasn't able to answer questions that would have exposed the government for what it is. And here we go again. And another set of extraordinary comments was yesterday when the Premier said that this was a normal departure. He was a hand-picked Director-General from the Premier. He was less than a year in to a 5-year contract. This isn't business as usual. This is chaos and crisis. And services matter, and they are breaking down because of it. And when you have a government at war with themselves, consumed by their own dysfunction, it's Queenslanders who run second fiddle to the survival of the government. And we are seeing that play out right across the board. We now have 2 of the most senior Directors General responsible for 2 of the most important departments gone within a month. And neither of those were planned, contrary to what the Premier says. The government is in chaos and in crisis, and Queenslanders have never seen services rot as quickly as they are in front of their eyes. And it isn't the fault of the public service. The public service are putting up with this nonsense day in, day out. And we intend to make sure that they feel valued, they feel respected, they feel empowered, and ministers are going to be held accountable. An end to the circus that we are seeing on a daily basis.
The Wellcamp report is due out tomorrow. The Premier says she's hosting a press conference tomorrow, but if the report comes out afterwards, she'll release a statement.
Well, we called this last week, didn't we? I'd be doing you a great disservice if I didn't allow you the floor. Over to you, Jarrod.
I have nothing to say about this matter, but look, I did I think I've done 2 or 3 press conferences this week where I said it will likely be a Friday drop that Queenslanders, the government, will attempt to hide this over the weekend. And I also said, and it's likely we've been told now that it will be tabled tomorrow in Parliament. And I hope when it is tabled, it is released publicly available so we can all see. I think the Premier has a history of these types of reports, either from the Auditor-General CCC, the Premier just happens to be either not around or does stand up before the report. I would say to the Premier that maybe just delay the press conference for a little bit tomorrow, maybe do a late afternoon press conference when she has the report and she has time to read it, and she has enough ministerial media advisors in her office who would be able to sit down with her today and say, Premier, we would suggest let's do an afternoon press conference. That gives you enough time to be briefed and fully prepped on the Wellcamp report that's going to be handed down tomorrow, and then we won't have this ridiculous situation. The Premier always says, oh, well, I didn't know it was going to be tabled, that's why I stood up beforehand. It is a planned, deliberate attempt by the Premier to avoid scrutiny, as she always does and has done over the last 8 years. The second point I'll make on the Wellcamp, we don't know what's in the report. But this we do know. The government knows what's in the report because the Auditor-General's confirmed that they've had the draft report. Now, we will be looking through the report and we'll obviously be responding to the elements of the report. But nothing will change the fact, whatever's in the report or not in the report, nothing will change the fact this Labor government had a political get-square with a former coalition government at the time. They wasted $220 million on Wellcamp, aka Waste Camp, White Elephant, and $220 million of Queensland taxpayer money wasted that could have been spent and better invested to solve the issues of the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, the homelessness issue we've got at the moment, the youth crime crisis, and the health crisis. That's where the money should have been invested.
Jarrod,
Yep. Yeah, John.
Fatal crash in Little Mountain. I know you and others for some time been calling for safety upgrades in the area. Probably too late, obviously.
Yeah, look, that's in my electorate, and I've seen the fatality overnight, which is just around the corner from where I live, actually. So I just want to say to the family involved, it was a motorcyclist who lost his life about midnight last night. My thoughts and prayers go out to the family because it'd be a terrible, it's a terrible, tragic circumstance of what's happened on Sunset Drive. The second point to that is that the community have been calling for council to look at Sunset Drive, Sugarbag Road and Parklands Boulevard for years now for safety improvements. And we've had 6 fatalities on our roads on the Sunshine Coast this year alone, and unfortunately we've had 2 in the last 2 weeks. It's a call that no police officer or first respondent wants to make to any family. So the family would just be feeling today. So all we can offer is our thoughts and prayers. The second thing is, though, that we'll be following this up with council in terms of safety improvements on the roads around Parklands Boulevard, particularly the intersection at Sunset Drive and Parklands Boulevard. We have a petition out at the moment calling for safety improvements to that road, particularly in the school zone. And unfortunately, the Sunshine Coast Council have rejected our call to increase the school zone into that intersection area. And I'll redouble my efforts with the community now to try and get those improvements from the Sunshine Coast Council underway.
I haven't had a chance to read the report. The Deputy has. Did you want to make some comments on that?
Well, thank you. The leader was out in Toowoomba this morning and at a business breakfast with the Shadow Treasurer and has just driven back here to attend the press conference. I haven't read the 300 pages in full, Leader, but I have seen the reports. I'd make this point, obviously without having read the report, that the difference is, in New South Wales, there is a report that you can read. There is a report that's publicly available, 300 pages of it, and no doubt many people, including this room, will be going through that report. The difference in Queensland is we have 2 reports that are completely hidden from Queenslanders. We have the former public trustee, the Peter Khan report, which is before the High Court at the moment, and we have the Jackie Trad report in the appointment of the Under-Treasurer in Queensland that Jackie Trad is trying to hide in the Supreme Court of Queensland so Queenslanders can't see what's in that CCC report. So the difference in New South Wales is, at least, having not read the report, at least we can read it. At least it's publicly available. Shannon Fentiman, as Attorney-General, has paid, using Queensland taxpayer money to hide the CCC report which involved her good mate Jackie Trad. So I would implore the Queensland Government and Jackie Trad to cease the Supreme Court matter and release the report, so just as New South Welshmen can look at their report into their politicians, Queenslanders can look at the CCC reports into their politicians, and mates like Jackie Trad is best mates with Shannon Fentiman.
I just want to make one more comment before we go. Today, the LNP is announcing that we will be holding our 33rd Queensland Health Crisis Town Hall, and we are going back to Caboolture, and we will be doing it on Thursday of next week in the morning at the Caboolture Showgrounds. It was at that venue that I met some of the bravest Queenslanders I have ever met, and to know that they were failed so badly by the system and they weren't believed, they weren't listened to, in my mind just showed why the health system is in such a state of disrepair. It's been nearly 2 years since that was first raised, and the allegations that we have seen in the last couple of weeks shows that not only is this problem not going away, it's getting worse. And we are going out there, we will be listening, we will be taking their fight to the floor of Parliament, and the government mightn't be listening to each other, but we are listening to Queenslanders, and we're looking forward to meeting people at the Caboolture Showgrounds next week. Thank you all.
All good.
See you later.
Cheers.